In today's presentation, I will analyze and discuss the development of education in Afghanistan at the intersection of religion and state over the course of the past 35 to 40 years. And the key question that I'm going to address in today's presentation is how far and to what extent religion and the state have influenced developments in education in Afghanistan. My main argument is that the conflict which is mainly waged in the name of religion in Afghanistan is primarily political in nature, but that religion has been brought into the conflict as a further layer of theological argument in order to achieve certain predetermined political goals. On the relationship between religion and state, I would like to briefly state that religion and state in Afghanistan have a very intimate relationship. Unlike some of the Muslim majority countries like Turkey, at least until recent years, and former Soviet Union Central Asian republics, Afghanistan has never adopted secularism as the principle of the modern state. So the separation of religion and politics, or in its Western definition, the separation of church and the state, in a way that the former or the church has no influence on the state, is not imaginable. Because in a very traditional division of labor, the state has always taken the responsibility of providing security and defending the country against foreign aggressions, whereas the religious establishments, and I would like also to clarify here before I continue, when I say religion, I do not mean Islam, nor I do not mean the Quran, and I do not mean the religion of Islam at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, 1,400 years ago. When I talk about religion, I mean religious authorities. I mean the religious establishments. So sometimes for the ease of talking, I would just say religion. But what I mean is the religious establishments. Because the reason is that our access to religion is through a series of interpretations that has developed over the course of history. And those who claim to have authority over these interpretations are the religious authorities and the religious establishments. So the religious establishments have taken the role of defining and guaranteeing the country's religious identity, but also to interpret and implement their version of or their interpretations of religion. So there is a very intimate relation between religion and the state. But there is also another layer of this intimate relationship, that the state always needs the support of religious establishments, not only for the validation of their political authority, but also for the implementation of their political goals. And the religious establishments have also often, was the case, that it was the religious establishments who would validate the political authority of the ruler, be it a king, sultan, a monarch, president, or a king. It's only in the recent 3 presidential elections that the public vote and give authority or legitimacy to the president. But otherwise, it has always been the religious establishments and the state. So this much about the relationship between the state and the religious establishments. Now, a little bit, I want to talk to you about my analytical approach to the case itself. I don't want to take much time on this matter. In my personal analytical approach is that I prefer and critical epistemology in my studies of the subject matter. An epistemology that is rooted in critical historical inquiry. And that's for two reasons. One is that we need to know the subject matter itself. We need to have a critical analysis of the subject matter itself. In the case of today, is education and the intersection of religion and state. At the second level, we need to know, how do I know that my own understanding of the subject matter is correct or not? So we need to put our own understanding of the subject matter to a critical historical analysis. And I'm also very fond of research methodological principles. And for that matter, I analyzed this case, and my analytical approach is that I will submit my own analytical approaches to the methodological principle. So in this case, it's a qualitative framework or then an embedded single case study research design. I don't want to lecture on that matter because I know you all know much better than me. But just as a methodological issue, the reason that I do it is that to make sure that we as researchers, as individuals, we have our own limitations as well. And I talk from my own experience, because there are what I would call it, or what in the literature would sometimes refer it as a stubborn mentality. We do have our own stubborn mentality, particularly when it comes to our own tradition, when it comes to our own history, when it comes to our own religion. Now, for the reason that we have to break that and deconstruct, we need some methodological approaches. So the reason that I put it into embedded single case study research design is that this case, for me, has 3 embedded units, and that's education, and that's religion, and the state. So basically, the case is studied through its units of analysis. Now, before I'm going to bring how education has been influenced at the intersection of religion and state, I would like to take you through a small journey to the last 2 to 3 years of 1970s. And that's the beginning of the chronological time frame for my presentation today. And I tell you why it is important. In the last 2 to 3 years, the region around Afghanistan, but also internationally, has experienced major political changes and political turmoil that influenced the decades to come. In July 1977, General Zia-ul-Haq, to whom I later will refer just General Zia, stages a military coup in Pakistan and overthrows Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was in power from 1973 to 1977. A year later, in a controversial court sentence, he executes Bhutto. Year after, in April 1978, the leftist political party, People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, to which I will refer as its acronym PDPA, overthrows President Mohammad Dawood in 1978 and through a military coup, and establishes a pro-Soviet Union government in Afghanistan. In February 1979, Reza Shah Pahlavi leaves Iran. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returns to Iran and takes political power. A few months later, in April, in a theocratic national constitution, the majority of the Iranian public decides Iran to become an Islamic republic. And in December 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini is declared the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Concurrently, in December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Now, this was a little bit of the contextual background for you to understand how the situation from here onwards unfolds and how these political developments have major impacts on what happens in Afghanistan and also what happens in the rest of the world. Just a little bit to forget about that previous slide now. What happens that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it turns Afghanistan into a battlefield of proxy wars. I'm talking about the battlefield of proxy wars in plural, not proxy war in singular. Proxy wars in plural. Because we have a number of major powers in the world who in Afghanistan compete for their political interests. The invasion of Afghanistan attracts the attention of the United States and her Western and the Arab allies. They come to Pakistan and then they promote what has come to be known as the global jihad. The United States is primarily interested in defeating the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and possibly to roll back the Soviet empire from the gates of South Asia. Saudi Arabia is primarily interested in the spread of their Wahhabi interpretation of Islam in Afghanistan and possibly to Central Asian republics at a later stage. But also they are interested to marginalize and sideline the Iranian theocrats from the affairs of Afghanistan, but also from the regional affairs. Pakistan has her own interest in the war in Afghanistan for two reasons. Firstly, Pakistan is concerned that a strong Afghanistan, with the support of Soviet Union, sympathetic towards India, will challenge Pakistan's security. And at the second level, the Pakistan president, General Zia, has had his own personal reasons in the global jihad phenomenon, as well as in the war in Afghanistan. Because what happens is that Zia-ul-Haq comes to power unconstitutionally through a military coup. Zia-ul-Haq also has a black spot in his military and political career, and that's his involvement in the Jordanian civil war in the 1970 and 71, when thousands of Palestinians were killed. So for him, in order to overcome and hide these two shortcomings, so he uses the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a pretext to call for a global jihad. The political parties or the jihadi parties in Afghanistan, they did not emerge after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Rather, they had already been against the state long before the Soviet invasion. They were in the 1970s. They wanted to overthrow President Daoud's government and to come to power by themselves. But it was their rival leftist party, the PDPA, that took the power, not them. Now, they see an international support for their cause because the international community is fighting against the Soviet Union and the government. So they want to take their own advantage. Now, you see that what happens here is that everybody is interested in this war in Afghanistan. Nobody is interested in what happens about the people of Afghanistan, but everybody pursues one's own political interests. So what happens here is that we have a politicization of religion, and we have a militarization of the phenomenon of jihad. And thus, we have for the first time in modern history what we call global jihad and global jihadism, which we now see across the world, Middle East, Europe, North America. Now, I will briefly touch on the concept of jihad, just to give you a bit of explanation, and I'm sure that if you want, you can explore it further for yourself, but just a little bit on the concept of jihad. I'll talk about three aspects of jihad, or about three debates about jihad. One is linguistically. Jihad is an Arabic word, and it means effort, exhaustion, extortion, and strain. So none of these meanings have any relationship to warfare. Jihad as a Quranic concept, jihad is used in the Quranic verses, but the Quran does not treat jihad and warfare in the same way. Rather, Quran treats jihad in a more comprehensive way. For example, if in the Quran God talks about wage a jihad in the path of God, it doesn't mean that go take a sword and kill a person. Rather, warfare has its own parameters, clearly defined parameters. So jihad and warfare is not the same in the Quran. Now, in the Muslim literature, we have two definitions of jihad, at least two definitions. One is that the spiritual, which also known as the greater jihad, and the other one is the physical, which is also known as the lesser jihad. So in the Muslim literature, they define and they promote the spiritual jihad. However, we also have fundamentalists or the supporters of textual Islam, and they are in favor of defining jihad in a very military way, particularly in the modern period since the era of colonization. Now, what happens is that the international political factors in the war of Afghanistan, they are not interested in the spiritual form of jihad. They are interested in the violent definition of jihad, in the physical definition of jihad. So that's how they promote this violent definition of jihad. And that's how they promote Muslim jihadists from around the world to come in Afghanistan and fight the Soviet Union. However, nobody has ever given thought at that time that what will happen out of this global jihad in the future. So this much about the concept of jihad itself. Now, what happened that these international political factors internationalized the war in conflict in Afghanistan. So we have the United States of America versus the Soviet Union. We have Pakistan versus India. We have Saudi Arabia versus Iran. So therefore, I'm talking about a series of proxy wars, not just one proxy war. And then we have the politicization of religious beliefs and concept and the globalization of jihad. As I talked to you, Saudi Arabia was pursuing their own interest. Iran was pursuing their own interest, and then there was the. Now, what happens that at the same time we have a nationalization or internalization of international political interest. While these political superpowers, regional powers, pursuing their own interests, the petty parties, the jihadi parties, they were not only trying to pursue their own political and ideological interests, but they also become an extended hand of their sponsors and supporters. So that's why we see an intensification of ethnic conflict and an intensification of religious conflict, Sunni versus Shia. And we have the radical Sunnis against the moderate Sunnis. So we have all form of political and religious developments in Afghanistan. The Shia parties, they try to represent the Shia and ethnically Hazara minority group, and they are trying to create a space for the Shia and ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, while the Sunni parties, they are interested in defeating the central government and establishing an Islamic state in line with the Sunni religious doctrines, and also ethnically Pashtun and Tajiks are also interested to promote their own interests, ethnic interests. Now, what happens to education? That's what our main subject is, that what happens to education at the intersection of religion and the state. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the pro-Soviet government, adopts Marxist-Leninist secular ideology. As a matter of ideological principle, they promote the interest of oppressed classes in society. So these oppressed classes in society include religious and ethnic minorities. But they also promote women's education and creating a social space, a public space for women, because women is also defined under the category of marginalized or oppressed class in society. So therefore, we have a massive participation of women in the education sector in Afghanistan. At the Ministry of Education, it's about 42, 48%. Ministry of Higher Education is around 45% participation. However, they also manipulate the education system. They establish parties, junior organizations across primary, secondary, and higher institutions of education. They also monopolize the textbooks, the curriculum, particularly history, sociology, economics, and politics, but also teacher education programs. However, they also provide thousands of scholarships to poor and middle and lower middle classes, something that did not exist previously. So these scholarships came from East Bloc countries, from Cuba to East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, and former republics of the Soviet Union. Now, what happens on the other side, the religious or the jihadi or the Islamist parties, they also politicize education. So at one level, in order to counteract against the state's education system and schools, they define modern or state educational institutions as centers of un-Islamic or anti-Islamic propagations. By defining it in these terms, they also issue religious decrees and making these schools a target of violent actions. So what happens is that the schools are burned, teachers and students were killed. So you see, both sides are interested in the political and ideological ideas. But the victim in between is the education and the ordinary public itself. However, what matters more to me and what matters more to people of Afghanistan, but also in the wider global context, is that a massive militarization of education and politicization of education, to which I will refer now. Now, by the mid-1980s, what happens is that the religious parties or the jihadi parties, they have a considerable loss of their fighters. So basically, the first generation of jihad fighters are about to extinguish. So new soldiers, new jihadi fighters are needed. And yet, at the same time, there is no sign of the retreatment of the Soviet army from Afghanistan. So what happens, there is a need for a new generation of jihadi fighters. So from where do you supply this? So the only way to supply is to promote people in Afghanistan to migrate to Pakistan. And from this pool of migrants, educate this young generation in madrasas, in refugee schools, indoctrinate them, and prepare them for the fight against the Soviet Union, Soviet army, and the government of Afghanistan. Now, how this happens? So I tell you how this happens. It becomes an official policy of the United States, but unfortunately of her Western and Arab allies as well. Now, the United States Aid for International Development provides $50 million grant for the University of Nebraska at Omaha. The Education Department of the University of Nebraska comes to Pakistan in consultation with the government of Pakistan, with the religious parties of Pakistan, but also with the Sunni religious parties of Afghanistan who are based in Pakistan. In consultation, they develop what I would call, or what we call it, jihad education or war curriculum. Now, I give you examples of this war curriculum that were developed in Pakistan by the University of Nebraska with the financial aid of the US aid, and then these were taught in madrasas and refugee schools in Pakistan. Now you see here an example that teaching alphabet for children at primary level. This is a Pashto alphabet textbook, but there are Persian versions of this as well. So here you see Allah is one and Muhammad is Allah's messenger. You see T for Topak, which is a Pashto word, means gun. Ahmad has a gun, and Ahmad does jihad with gun. Here you see that Aleph is for Allah. Allah is one, Muhammad is Allah's messenger. Te is Torah, which I just read for you. Ahmad has got a sword. He does jihad with sword. The is Topak, my uncle has got a gun. He does jihad with gun. Mim is for Mujahideen. Mujahideen fight the infidels. Infidels meant Russians and the government of Afghanistan. My uncle goes to jihad. So you see here for primary one mathematics, you see the machine gun, the hand grenade, the bullets, gun, revolver, knife. So these were the kind of indoctrination of students in the name of religion and jihad. Now, one of the major themes of this jihad education was the concept of migration and jihad itself. So the textbooks were encouraging families to leave Afghanistan and migrate to Pakistan. They were describing Afghanistan allegorically as the Mecca of the time of Prophet Muhammad, that Muslims when in Mecca were persecuted, so the Prophet and his companion migrated to Medina. So allegorically, Medina was Pakistan. So encouraging people to follow the Prophet's model to come to Pakistan. Once these families were in Pakistan, from this pool of migrants, then they would subscribe children to these schools. Now, the United Nations, unfortunately, also played its own role in this politicization process. Families in the refugee camps would not receive rations unless they would become a member of one of the political parties. So when you would become a member of the political parties, you were obliged to send your children to these jihadi schools. Now, if a child at the age of 5 would go into these schools, at the age of 15, after being 10 years in the schools, he would be fully indoctrinated with hatred, violence, and intolerance. Now, this was not the whole story. What was happening that the Russians, for example, were described in these textbooks as the Christian enemy of Islam, as aimless infidels, as aimless communists, as savage people who have to be killed and who have to be massacred. Now, it was very clear from the beginning that what impact will this form of education will have. It would definitely guarantee conflict. There was no doubt about it right from the beginning, and that was the purpose, to generate conflict, hatred in society. And also, the way political parties in international, regional, and at national levels decided to politicize religion and militarize the education system, it was clear that a violent interpretation of jihad would emerge, and a very intolerant generation will grow in society, and they will promote a very violent version of jihad. So this form of politics and education govern on the principle of divide, intolerance, hatred, and anything that is other than universal human values. So as I said to you earlier, the way mathematics were taught to children, I don't know if you can see it from distance, but these are the machine guns, knives. But children were also taught how to use these guns with machine guns, with plastic machine guns, with knives, when they were at the age of teenage time, that they would be sent to war in Afghanistan. And in the 1996, when the Taliban came to power, the absolute majority of their soldiers were the madrasa students, teenagers. And those were the ones who in the 1980s entered these schools. So again, you say the same examples, and the explanation says that the teacher should ask students about counting and multiplying these objects in the picture. So now what happens that in 2001, the Taliban were overthrown from power. However, the atrocities that were committed under the Taliban is not unknown to anyone. So the Taliban would not tolerate modern education. They would not tolerate women's education, particularly beyond primary 3. And they would not tolerate anything other than their own strict interpretation of Islam. And the Taliban are those who were themselves indoctrinated and studied under this education system. Now, in 2001, the United States and her allies, after the September 11th attack in America, decides to overthrow the Taliban, capture Osama bin Laden, and destroy the Al-Qaeda network, restore peace and order by developing national security structures, training security forces in Afghanistan, and assisting the reconstruction process. One of the major outcomes of this post-Taliban political scenario was the Bonn Agreement. Bonn Agreement in December 2001. So in Bonn Agreement, it was decided that in Afghanistan, a moderate and responsible and a government that is answerable to the public, but also to the international community, shall emerge in Afghanistan. So it had several components. In order to do that, the international community committed to defeat the Taliban in terms of ideology as well as military. Prepared the ground for national election, parliamentary election, develop a new national constitution, and develop and reform the infrastructure, rebuild and reform the infrastructure. Now, it's also during this time that we have a new era of education after the fall of the Taliban. Religion still plays a major role in the current developments in Afghanistan as well. The national constitution gives a very important role to religion. However, religion in Afghanistan is not, or rather to say that religion is not a fundamental pillar of law in Afghanistan. In other words, the Sharia is not the fundamental principle of law in Afghanistan. The Sharia has its place, but the law itself is based on civil law. Nevertheless, there is religion has played an important role, and as the religious establishments and the state are still, they still do have an intimate relationship with each other, but at the same time, they compete for influence in education. For the government, it's very clear, for the international community, it's very clear that Afghanistan needs a reformed education system, because the public as well as the state is fearful of the perceived link between education, particularly madrasas, and extremism. And that is true because the Taliban are a testament to what happened to the education system in Afghanistan. So what happens in 2002, although the government is not prepared, but still the public and the government reopens the gates of schools and institutions of higher education for the public, and there is a back to school campaign, and In the first year, although the government and the UNICEF were prepared for 1.5 million intake of students, but the actual registration went beyond that. It was something over 2 million. These statistical figures I will give you at the end. We have a new curriculum framework, a series of reformed programs, a series of 5-year national education and strategic plans for education, and a deep fear of religious extremism and radicalism permeates the education system in Afghanistan. Now, I talked to you earlier about the role and the influence of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Now, we have the University of Nebraska at Omaha again in the education system, now in a way that tries to reform the education system. So this is a mathematics for primary 1, printed in 1381, which is 2002. Now, this is the earlier in the 1980s, and this is now the 2002. Now, can somebody imagine that if you change a page on the textbook, can you really remove the impact of 2 decades or 1.5 decades of indoctrination? You can't. So this is basically, it shows how political powers play with the public and with the education. So this is the new reform textbook. So it is called reform, but it is not a reform. Anyhow, the future of education and the future of the education reform really depends on a number of issues. Among them, from educational perspective, you all know better than me that the supply of qualified teachers is very, very important. If you do not have a good school building, and if you don't have quality textbooks, but if you have qualified teachers, a good teacher can remedy, can substitute these shortcomings. But if you do not have good teachers, then you are in a big problem. Now, quantitatively, in terms of numbers and figures, there has been a massive increase in the number of students. It shows the public enthusiasm. We had 2 million students in 2002 and 2003. 2003 to 4, we got it 4.5 million. In 2013, we have 9.3 million registered students. I know for the fact that these figures are not totally reliable. And I know for the fact that there are a lot of what we call ghost students and ghost schools. Nevertheless, out of 9.3, at least 7 million students are there. But the question is that do the 7 million students receive quality education? Are there qualified teachers? So this is a big, big challenge for the government. And we have some 15,000, almost 20,000 schools, but not all of them are always functioning because of the lack of security. But 700,000 adult literacy learners, on that I do little doubt because that is more or less true. Now, what will happen in the future, it depends very much on how political authorities, how politicians, and how religious establishments decide about the future of education. This is a university called Nangarhar in the southern part of Afghanistan. The picture is from the last week. Students raise the flags or the banners of the ISIS, of the Al-Qaeda, and of the Taliban. Now, they have their own reasons probably to do that, whether it is lack of good education, whether they don't have a good hostels, or whatever that might be. But to raise the flag of these 3 flags is itself seriously, troubling. Now, it shows that what is the situation in Afghanistan. And while I was preparing this presentation for you, Afghanistan, we had, this is my last 2 points that I want to tell you. There was a massive demonstration against the government, like something like hundreds, thousands of people came to the streets of Kabul, but also to the streets of other provinces in Afghanistan. Because the Taliban and the ISIS, or what are called today ISIS, they were yesterday the Taliban, and they were the Al-Qaeda. they killed 7 members of the Hazara ethnic community. Among them, 3 were women, one of them a 9-year-old child. So basically, they slit their throat. So that's how the public went out and took the coffins to the presidential palace, that we want an end to this situation. And 2-3 days later, the Paris attack happened. To me, I have no doubt that the globalization of jihad, the promotion of a violent form of jihad, plays a major role in what happens today in Afghanistan as well as in the rest of the world. So this is what that I wanted to share with you today, and thank you for your attention.
Here and ideas, and I would like to welcome Dr. Yahia to University of Sussex and thank him for the great presentation he offered. My question to Dr. Yahia is that we know from your presentation, and I personally also have the information back from the country, like how the whole education system in Afghanistan is and how it was used to be when lots of our people were immigrants in Pakistan and things like that. You displayed some of the pages from the textbooks of the elementary schools at that, from that time, and also the current photo from the Nangarhar University. I mean, these are all things of major concern to all of us. From your perspective, or from your information, based on your knowledge, like how do you see the future for the education, like in the long run, in the way forward? What do you think needs to be done specifically and exactly in order to come out of the current situation of the education in the country, so that people could have access to quality education and throughout the country? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Habibullah, for your question, and thank you for welcoming me. You know, something that is such an important element in society, that is, on the one hand, it can serve as a catalyst for development, and as well as a development of many other factors, whether it is security, whether it is understanding of religion, whether it is economy, whether it is the promotion of pluralism and the idea of tolerance, and whether it is social services. On the other hand, education is also dependent on the simultaneous development of all these other elements in society. So education is also very, very vulnerable. And perhaps the most vulnerable element in society is education. Now we are in Sussex University. We take this building, we take this Center for International Education for granted because it is already here. But if you look how much work has been put into this center to make it international as it is today, you really need to put a lot of hard work in that. I give you an example. I'm a research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. My institute is 38 years old. The reason that I give to this example, because this is always in my head. In 38 years, the Institute of Ismaili Studies managed to develop itself into an institute that is internationally recognizable, and its research and publications are respected. And we have a pool of over 100 staff and another 80 perhaps students. 38 years work in the heart of world civilization today in Europe and in the United Kingdom. Millions of pounds have been spent. The best scholars from around the world has come always in this institute and has done research, and I'm part of that, and I'm contributing to that. It took 38 years to develop building a center of perhaps of this size of this building physically. In 38 years, how much destruction has happened in Afghanistan. Can you believe that? When it comes to destruction, it's so easy to destroy a country. And if you want to rebuild it, you can't rebuild it with money. You cannot rebuild it with just developing new textbooks, reforming here and there something. So as I say to you, my message, it has always been for the government of Afghanistan, where I worked for 2 years in 2006 and 2007 as a national coordinator of UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. If the government today decides to honestly bring a genuine reform, if the religious parties honestly commit to stop the promotion of violence and to think honestly about the development in Afghanistan, it will take at least a good generation of hard work to rebuild Afghanistan and to rebuild the education system. It doesn't mean that it will take another century, but it will depend on so many other factors. I know for the fact that meritocracy is not a top priority in the education, so is in the government. So there's so many other elements, unless they all do not combine and they all do not come together and commit for the development of quality education, particularly teacher education. You can't have the quality of education
anymore. Hello, myself Shushri. I'm from India. I'm a master student of childhood and youth study. And thank you very much for a great eye-opening presentation. This is for me particularly, being so close to the country, but we never knew about all this thing. What I learned, like the reformation which started from 2002, it is at the primary level. It would be really good if you can throw a little light about the other aspect of reformation, whether it's with secondary education or with the teacher, training program, or what are the other forms reformation aspects, education reformation aspect? Because what we saw, it's like the textbook in the primary level. What was the secondary education before, and what is the reformation right now?
It's a very general question. Shall we a little bit narrow it down?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, it's
okay. I'll take two more questions, okay, and probably we can narrow it a little bit down.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentation. In the background to the conflict, you talked about the clash between US and Soviet Union, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, India as being influences. But the main focus that you showed us was actually the US's intervention through the University of Nebraska. Do you have any evidence of the way that those other clashes influenced the development of the education system in Afghanistan? So for the role of Iran, the role of Saudi Arabia, the role of India, are they equally evident in terms of the engagement or manipulation of curriculum, schooling?
In terms of the role of Iran, Iran has a very different position during the 1980s. The position of Iran is different for two reasons. One is that the Iranian theocrats, they declared a total rejection of the West. So as we know, there was not much interaction between the government of Iran and the United States and the Western allies on the one hand. Secondly, Iran was engaged in 8 years of a very extensive war with Iraq. So if you look at these two issues, it really put Iran a little bit, pushed it back from the active involvement in the case of Afghanistan. And thirdly, Iran hosted Shia Isna Ashari religious parties inside Iran. But Iran did not accept the textbooks that were developed in Pakistan by the University of Nebraska, because it was developed by the United States of America, And because in Iran, what happened that there were not refugee camps in the same way as they were in Pakistan. Iran did not accept the NGOs, the international non-governmental organizations. So whatever education was provided for the refugees from Afghanistan were in two forms. One is the refugee self-governed schools that the Shia Isnasharis from Afghanistan in Iran, they developed their own schools and they taught the Iranian curriculum. Or those Afghans who were accepted as refugees in Iran, they were allowed to study in Iranian national education system. Now, the role of Iran and the role of Saudi Arabia comes through extracurricular activities. The extracurricular activities comes through the way that Iran was promoting the export of their own version of Islamic revolution and the governance of jurisconsults. I don't know if you're familiar with this term or not, but it's not very much either. So basically, Iran was trying to import its own interpretation of Islam through the religious parties and through the mosque and the other religious education system. But Iran did not have an influence in this education system. The influence of the Saudi Arabia was more or less very clear because it came through two ways. One is the funding that the Saudi Arabians were providing, and the other one was through the Deobandi school. Those who are from Pakistan and from India, more or less, they know about the Deobandi movement. So that also comes through this interpretation, violent interpretation of a very strict interpretation of Islam. So, but their influence is also through a lot of extracurricular activities that come. It's not necessarily direct street education. But the reason that these textbooks are important, because they are from primary and secondary level, these were the ones that were taught in absolute majority of madrasas and refugee schools. And that's were taught until the end of the Taliban. And that's also an interpretation or a version of this is still in place, and a very extremist education is still in place in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan. Now on the question of what was the education system before this? The education system before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a very ordinary education system. Education system that was developed by the UNESCO, by the University of Nebraska, was involved before the war in Afghanistan as well. And the University of Columbia was involved, the Soviet Union was involved in different forms of education in Afghanistan. For example, Germany developed a number of technical and vocational schools as well as academic schools in Afghanistan. France had their own education system in Afghanistan, and the British education system was adopted from the early 20th century in Afghanistan. So before the 1980s or before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, education was a very normal education system like all other countries around the world. The phenomenon of the global jihad and the phenomenon of violent interpretation of jihad, and that's how this enters the education system, emerges afterwards. And that also permeated the secondary level. So this is a very broad debate, and just in a very simple way, this much I think would be sufficient. Unless if you come with another question, but okay.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sroj. I'm Development Studies first year undergrad student. My question would be, in your presentation, probably in your research, you must have come across the transparency and accountability sector in the education and the fraud embezzlement, the amount of money that has been funded, and the then education minister that was accused of the fraud. How larger the impact would have been in positive manner if that fraud has not happened or the money has been spent in an appropriate way in education. Second question would be in terms of the influence of the current education system. Is that greater than the religious scholars, imams or mullahs that we have back in our home? what I can see from the picture, for example, that's not even a month-old picture. The students are probably in their 20s, but still they have spent like 10 years of their life within the Kurdish regime, but still they are protesting pro-Taliban or ISIS. Don't you think that the religious scholars have got more influences on the youth there and the students than the education system that we have?
Are you referring to the corruption in the recent years? Yeah. So unfortunately, the level of corruption has been very widespread in Afghanistan, not only within the government, but also within the international organizations. And the level of corruption has been also very widespread in the education sector. From my own research, I know that during the years of 2007 and 2010, there were around 10,000 of ghost teachers. 10,000 ghost teachers. Ghost teachers meaning that they were subscribed, but actually didn't exist. Now, if you imagine 10,000 teachers, if you just calculate by $100 a month of salary, and you multiply 10,000 in 1 year, we're talking about something over a few years' time, about $100 million of corruption. So in a country like Afghanistan, $100 million corruption in the poor education system is a very, very big number. So there's no way to underestimate this level of corruption. Had this corruption not been there, I think this is just a hypothesis, and to what extent hypothesis helps reality is obviously if there's no corruption, there will be better quality of life, that we will have better schools. Now, I know for the fact, even in the city of Kabul, there are schools under 10. So with $100 million, you can build thousands of schools across the country. But unfortunately, when the political system is in a way that it promotes certain goals, let us say either these are religious or ethnic or ideological, so the rest doesn't matter. As long as the political authorities achieve these major goals, that I want to be in power and I want to have certain people around myself in power, as long as they achieve this, they don't care about the rest. They don't care what happens. Had they been caring about the public, about the education system, this form of education would not develop in the first instance. So it's very clear nobody cares about the public. Now, on this issue of Nangarhar University in the south, as I told during my presentation, they may have their genuine reasons. They may be a pressure group. They may put pressure on the government to improve the quality of life in student hostel. They may demand better food in the dining rooms, or maybe better educational facilities. They may not genuinely believe in the Taliban or in the Al-Qaeda or in the Islamic Caliphate that they want. But what matters is that when flags like this are raised, it raises serious concerns about the legitimacy and about the ability of the government. And obviously, as I told you, that the education is not just a matter of sitting in classroom. It's not just a matter of teaching a textbook. The way people go to mosque, the way people sit in shops, the way people go to coffee shop, the way people listen to their elders, the way all this violent interpretation or spread matter. The religious scholars, what we call religious scholars, by the definition of scholarship, they're not scholars. It is just a title that traditionally has been inherited by them. Like Avicenna, you may know, that's called as a scholar. Farabi is a scholar. These are the scholars. Are these people also scholars like Farabi, like Avicenna? They are not. So they have inherited the title, but they don't have that scholarship. That has its own history, and that's why when I talk about the there is a stubborn mentality around all of us, and particularly people at the ordinary level. They don't have the intellectual means to deconstruct their own stubborn mentality and to see where and when certain elements in their culture, in their tradition, in their religion gone wrong. So they don't have that means. And to reform it, you need to reform so many things around in society to be able to reform the education system.
Thank you very much, Yahia. That was really interesting. In terms of your curriculum analysis, you showed the differences in the textbooks. I'm quite interested to hear more about how those. I don't know if your research involved any study of classroom processes or any interviews with teachers or education directors and so on. But how could you talk more about how those different textbooks were mediated in the classroom? A kind of background to that. Also, I'm interested in the extent to which it was a very, these are very masculine images, and the extent to which I think Afghanistan has signed up to all the gender equality legislation. But what are the implications of that kind of textbooks for gender?
Are you talking about the reform textbooks now?
Well, more in the past, I suppose.
In the past?
Yeah.
In the past, unfortunately, it was no longer possible to observe the classroom scenarios because by the time the Taliban were out of power and by the time I got the chance to become a researcher and to go back to Afghanistan and do research, so these madrasas were not accessible. However, I do know from my own research the way these madrasas operate and the way these madrasas did operate in the past to a certain extent. But I do not have my own first-hand observation of teaching of these textbooks in the classrooms. And that would be an answer to the question of Habibullah and as well as our friend. In Afghanistan, we have two forms of education system, two parallel education systems. One is what we call it modern or the so-called secular, but actually it is not secular because it has a considerable element of religious education in itself, what we call modern education. But the other one is madrasa education, which is known as religious education. Now, the religious education, there are several sub-parallel systems. Now, just to be very brief, we have the state madrasas that state control and provide national curriculum for it. We have privately registered madrasas. The government does not have influence on how it operates or how it recruits its teachers, but the government does have a control over its curriculum. And while they teach national curriculum, they get some incentives from the government. And then we have privately unregistered madrasas. And there are madrasas, cross-border madrasas, that either in Iran or in Pakistan. So you see there is a parallel educational systems. And what happens in madrasas, so these textbooks were mostly taught in madrasas. Madrasas operate very independently and a very low cost. Let us say educated figure, normally called mullah or cleric, in a village, he would teach 10, 15, 20, 50, whatever children are in the village. He would teach all of them, let us say from level 1 of primary to level 4. So, and after 4, the child would go to a bigger madrasa. So it's a very male-dominated because the teacher itself is a man. And the madrasas, often non-registered madrasas, often operate around either one person or a number of people. So these textbooks equally were taught either in the form of private madrasas or in the form of organized madrasas that everything looks like the classroom, everything would look like the normal education system, but the teachers were graduates of traditional madrasas. So it was not just only the teaching of the textbooks, but a lot of things that comes from the teacher, from his interpretation or explanation of the textbook to students. So the situation was not just simply teaching a textbook that was here, but the teacher would bring a lot of things from his own personal interpretation of Islam, not only the creed or the doctrine of school of jurisprudence to which he belongs, but also his own understanding, his own interpretation of his own school of jurisprudence. So basically there is no monitoring system, there's no check and balance. If I would be the teacher, I could teach anything that I would like to students. And of course there was incentive for these teachers to teach these textbooks and the other things. And that also, if you position that education, that form of education, within a very violent and volatile context of Afghanistan, particularly if the madrasa teacher had lost a family member in the war against the Russian army or against the government, he would teach anything that he would like. He would describe the Russians anything he would like. Or today, when they call for against the international involvement in Afghanistan, I know for the fact there are madrasas that teach thousands of women in Afghanistan, in the north, in the south. The students go to these madrasas, they come back home, and they tell to their own parents that the daughter says to mother that you lost the Islamic way of life. You have to wear hijab, you have to wear the niqab, all these things. So it is not simply a matter of one textbook or two textbooks. When you ask me about where is the influence of Saudi Arabia, there is this influence of Saudi Arabia. There is the influence of Iran. There is influence of the other countries. In the same way as the modern textbooks have the influence of the modern world, they have their own influences. So as you asked how to reform the education system, there is no way to reform it unless there is a genuine political and religious commitment to it.
Well, while there's a lull in questions, I'll ask one. I mean, I can't, for the sake of my own well-being, leave here with such a kind of really depressing picture. So I want you to give me a bit of hope somewhere along the line. And I want to just think about where are the spaces, even if they're not in formal political organisations, where are the spaces where people can demand education and a quality kind of education somewhere?
Unfortunately, I'm also caught often between these two pictures of Afghanistan. One side is very dark picture, and if people do not see hope in a society, regardless whether it's in the Western countries, if in a poor suburb, if a young man does not see a hope for his own life in the future, or it is in Afghanistan, if a person or a community does not see a hope in the future, unfortunately, it's a very dark prospect. But if we can replace this lack of hope with hope, then there is a bright future. Then there is a prosperity. I see this hope in a large number of civil society organizations that operate in Afghanistan. And that's what Afghanistan also needs to develop, middle class and civil society organizations, because the government really fails to provide even very basic services, even to fulfill very basic obligations that it has got. However, the civil society organizations in Afghanistan and the media in Afghanistan is unprecedented, not only in the country, but also in the region. Anybody who understands Persian and can watch private television channels in Afghanistan, particularly Tulor Television Channel 1, and can look into the work of civil society organizations, they really get hope that the country is progressing. And the number of students, at the moment, we have at least 7 million students enrolled in primary and secondary level, let alone the higher education institutes. In the past 15 years, there has been a large rise in the number of higher education institutions. We have something like around 35 private institutions of higher education, private hospitals, clinics, private entrepreneurship that promote education from kindergarten to tertiary education. So it is not that there is no progress, it is not that there is no development. There is development. But what matters is that when we put it on when we look at from the perspective of the government, government is not able to take the benefit of the enthusiasm and the commitment that the public shows and have for education. And that's often for political and religious purposes. And the presentation today was to show education at the intersection of religion and the state. So therefore, I put aside a lot of other elements that come from civil society, comes from the public, and comes from the other aspects. If these other elements were not there, the country would not stand, and education, quantitatively at least, would not grow the way it has been growing. So to me, there is a bright future, but how do you manage this bright future? How do you process it matters. So far, we do not have that mechanism to process this enthusiasm, this potential, this energy into something which we admire.
Okay, well, if there are none. Is there a question? No. No. Well, I think it's just left to thank you, Yahia, very, very much for a very interesting.